All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience to hopefully, if we're doing a good job on this, keep you 10 steps ahead of the game. I am looking forward to this conversation as I look forward to every conversation, but this one in particular is going to be a fun one. I'm going to be digging into the topic of deepfakes and cybersecurity and what we can do as professionals, as individuals, as parents, like whatever it is, to just help prepare ourselves for the world that we're about to walk into. Because if you've been following my stuff for long, you know I talk a lot about we are entering the age of distrust, where it's going to be harder and harder to know what even is real anymore. So we're going to unpack that and dig into some of the really crappy advice out there that you may hear and go, hey, here's how you fix it. That we're going to go, yeah, actually, no. But what are some of the things that may actually legitimately help you navigate through this and also keep you up to date on where things are at? So to navigate that, I'm joined by Jason Thatcher, who founded Breacher.ai. So Jason, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to do this with you, and I think you're spot on. We're entering the age of distrust and eroding that fabric. So I think it's a really important conversation topic to cover, especially going to the elections and with all the advancement for deepfake too. It's gotten so realistic these past couple months.
I
Uh,
know.
it's freaking crazy.
The
Some
past few months have been and we're going to get into it, but like it's amazing how things that were like, yeah, it's kind and the thing I keep talking about with the AI space is every time we cast like a flag on like it's going to take us about this long to get here. This is like one area where usually in companies, projects, things like that, you're like, it's going to take this long. It always takes longer. I feel like with the AI space, it's the opposite. You're like, we've got 6 months before we get there. And it's like, oh, actually, it's been more like 2 weeks. So
Yeah, and you're so spot on. It's funny. I talk to people. And I'm like, hey, did you know that you can do this with like AI? For example, like audio cloning. I need 3 seconds of audio, and I can produce crystal clear, deep fake audio. Someone people are like, get out of here, for real. And it's literally it's like a
and
shot
they
of
think
light.
it's only and a lot of people think, well, that's only like hackers who have and you're like, no,
Mm-mm.
no, that's like Jimmy, your neighbor kid who wanted to, figure out a way to get out of school could do it so he can call the principal type of a thing. So we'll get
So
in, we'll get into it. So, but for background, just so folks who may not know you, I've had a chance to get to know you through this whole process, but what is your background? How did you end up here? Was this something that you always kind of had a passion for, or how did you end up at the intersection of kind of this security and deepfake stuff?
yeah, that's a great question. So I've done cybersecurity my whole career. I've worked in various aspects, usually SOC. Um, and I was playing around with AI one day. I was like, that stuff is hyped, right? I don't really buy
Okay.
into it. And I came across one application, which I won't name shame, but I took an audio file, cloned myself, and at that moment, it clicked. I
Clicked.
said, "Oh my God, this is really, really, really freaking bad, and something needs to be done like ASAP." And so from that day on, it really kind of shook me to my core, and I'm basically hell bent on a mission to drive awareness and knowledge to
Okay.
help kind of protect against deepfakes. So that's why I'm here. It's what I'm super super passionate about.
Okay. All right. I love that. And this to me is such an opportunity. Not only just because to your point, I don't think people realize. I mean, I remember one of the podcasting apps that I use, and this was a while ago, came out with the voice cloning. And I remember it was still early stage beta development when they first released it to a select few of us. And at the time, even then, it still only needed about 5 minutes of your voice. And very quickly, you could type up something and it generated it and it sounded very much, it was a little more nuanced. You could kind of tell it didn't sound quite right. But I'm like, similar to you, I went, I mean, there's some really beneficial use cases for this. I can see there's also some absolutely terrifying ones from that one. And I think a lot of people just don't realize, one, how easy it is, But also, if we're here now in April of 2024, how much further along are we going to be in 6, 8, 12, 18 months?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the problem, right? So I love that you use that word duality. In my mind, like deepfake is kind of outweighed with the threat that it poses, right? So there's a lot of really good applications. And I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of misperceptions, like deepfake is this terrible thing. No, there's some great things that can be done with it, right? But on the flip side, there's a lot of bad that can be done with it too. And it's just endless the amounts of malicious applications that you can use for deepfake. Voice cloning, like you name it, like there's some just so many different frauds or types of extortion that you can do with deepfake today. So it's it's kind of an unbalanced, like nefarious thing in my mind at the moment, right? There's more
it
bad.
is. Well, and I think that's where, and I feel like some of this just comes with human nature and society, where when there's big changes, it's very easy to focus on the nefarious side of like how this could all go wrong. And in some ways, I think that's healthy. We should be aware of the risks. In some of this stuff I'm seeing with tech advancement, we're not considering the risks enough. We're just like, hey, this is great. Like, what could possibly go wrong? But I do think, especially when it comes to things like voice cloning, video cloning, AI image generation, all these things, there's a lot of emphasis on how nefarious it is versus, I mean, I was talking to someone or reading something recently where somebody who had a severe injury where they aren't able to speak anymore, they were able to get a clip of their voice from years ago and voice clone it. And now they're able to communicate. And I'm like, what an amazing way to use this technology for this and that. I know creators who use it frequently for even simple things, where it's like, well, I would maybe word this a little bit different, or editing and things like that. And personally, I think some of the ethical sides of like, how far do you go before what's even real anymore type of a thing. But I think to your point, we have to balance this from a more what could be done, and how do we balance that versus scaring the snot out of everybody and thinking, oh, all this AI stuff's just going to destroy us.
Yeah, yep. You're absolutely correct. It has advanced really quickly too, right? And to your point, in 6 8 months, I think we're on the cusp of deepfake being so good that it's going to be indistinguishable between fake and real. And I think that's going to be the pivotal point where your trust in media is going to be challenged. And there's a lot of kind of these initiatives around watermarking and stuff like that to help people distinct between what's real and fake, which is a good step. But at the same time, like I'm worried that could backfire against people too, because a lot of this stuff is open source and it may not have that watermark. And that means that the malicious deepfake, when it's being used for bad, is that much more convincing, right? So
Yeah.
it's one of those cases where it is a double-edged sword, and the duality of AI and the preventative measures could potentially backfire as well, right? So,
Well, and as we get into some of the things that we see as kind of being put out there as ways to get around this or ways to solve for it, I think back to even just some of the societal human nature challenges that we have that we're battling against, which is where some people are like, just ban it. And I'm like, that's not going to work, because the reality is we've been doing this same kind of thing forever. I mean, really, when you think about, I just even think about how, in magazines, images are airbrushed. You're like, well, what is really that? Like, essentially, we're deep faking. I mean, sometimes some of these images are edited to the point where it's like, well, that's not even the person anymore. On social media, the AR filters and some of these other things where you start going, well, we're actually in some ways creating a live deep fake when we're doing this in this effort to kind of polish our edges and make everything sheen. So I think this idea that, oh, we'll just get rid of it and it'll just go away. It's like, well, that's actually not a terribly good strategy anyway, because people seek out this stuff one way or the other. And I think similar to what you said about things backfiring, sometimes when I hear people going, well, just ban all this technology for people. I'm like, well, yeah, but then all it does, kind of like the backfiring, is, well, it's already out there. So now it's just going to be in the hands of people who are going to abuse it, which means the people who now don't have access to it are going to wrongly assume, oh, everything must be real because we can't even do this stuff. And it's like, well, no, you can. And I think that's why it's just not helpful to say, just get rid of it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And the problem is a lot of this stuff is open source too, right? So it's funny, on my deepfake journey, I messed around with face swap and got a high GPU computer, played around with it, right? I wanted to understand how it works. And then I realized that I'm an idiot. And there's like literally a million applications to do the same thing in the cloud super easily. And it's beyond the point of being regulated, right? You can't ban it at this point. But I think that some of the laws that are emerging, like the Elvis Act, are really good steps in the right direction. I see that eventually deepfake will fall under the same sort of umbrella as like a DMCA claim, right? Where your image and likeness is copyrighted, and then you can basically go after people who are copying your brand, your personal brand, or your personal IP, and then use that, like basically use like a DMCA claim to get it removed, or say that it's infringing. I think that might be where we end up in the next 8 or 9 months. It's
I think, yeah. I mean, I think there's some big efforts. And actually, now that we're here, I actually just kind of thought about this. We're talking about this because here we've been nerding out on this backstage, and then even before when we met. I think there may be some people who end up listening and watching this going, you've talked a lot about this whole deepfake thing. I kind of have heard about it, but I don't necessarily even know what you're talking about. So when you're talking to people about what you mean when you're talking about deepfakes, for you, what is that umbrella category and what falls under there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it highlights a really good point, is this driving awareness and knowledge is literally the first step, right? Deepfake it's a subset of generative AI, right? It's basically being able to mimic a user, clone them, and then create a realistic likeness, and then being able to manipulate that media to do and say what you want. And I think it kind of highlights a good point, right? Is that behind these tools, right, there is that human element, right, that does that malicious behavior and that malicious intent. So it's not, comes back to the point, right? Deepfake by itself isn't a bad thing. It's a human factor behind it, right, that's manipulating it to do that. And
I think on that one, to that point, I think that's where it is really important to have these discussions about what do we really mean when we say this, because as a good example of this, there was a picture that went viral on Twitter, or X. I don't know that anybody's ever going to call it X, but went viral on Twitter, of an 80s, it looked like an 80s photograph of a dude smoking a cigarette while he's eating a Big Mac at McDonald's, type of a thing. And it went wild on this. And then it turned out the thing was AI generated. And there was this huge debate about, well, is that really a deep fake? I mean, it wasn't a person's likeness that they copied. And on the surface, it seems innocent enough. But again, going back to the intent of the person behind that, if you're trying to create a belief that something happened that didn't, even if you're not necessarily taking the likeness of an individual and trying to basically make a copy of that, you really are creating an artificial reality for a purpose outside of really what it was intended. And where that line goes from like harmless fun to, well, this is like misleading people in a wrong direction, can be really hard. Because as that example, that'd be a hard one to put like a claim on and go, well, that's my Uncle Bill, and Uncle Bill never smoked. And you're like, well, okay. That'd be like, this person never existed. Neither did the person behind them. That restaurant isn't even real. But in theory, you could use an image like that to say, look what happened in 1982 at, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's it is misinformation trust, right? It's going to blur that line. Like, where do you draw that ethical line between deepfake and what is malicious, right? And I think that's going to be kind of the ethical question that we find ourselves in, especially going up into the elections, right? So back in my mind, like going into 2024, it's not just the elections here in the US, it's globally, like there are elections all over the place. India has been a really big hotspot. So there was an article that I read the other day where it's basically it's rampant, and they're saying it's actually swaying the elections, right? So that misinformation, right, is changing kind of the outcomes of the elections or swaying public opinion. I think that's a real threat to watch in the next couple of months, is leading into that. I really believe that state actors like Russia, et cetera, are going to come in and basically do misinformation to try to sway the election one way or the other.
Well, and we're at such a state where society is, we're so react first, ask questions later, that, you know, I think that's one of the biggest risks we have right now, especially with, I mean, and that's oftentimes what deepfakes are preying on, is your desire to react quick before you really process this. I think of that example of the company in China where the guy got duped into giving $25 million. I guarantee, I mean, I wasn't there, but I read enough about it. I guarantee it was like this high pressure, you know, kind of thing that if you had stepped back and really thought about what happened and said, you know what, we need to validate this, you know, type of, excuse me, the whole, excuse me, the whole thing probably could have been avoided, but it's in that moment of like, we got to do this right now. And again, if that sense of urgency kicks in and you haven't taken the time to think, that's actually when you're most vulnerable to this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're spot on. You're spot on. And I think that's key. Like you're really hammering in on something that's really important. So training and educating people on being situationally aware, right, and understanding these threats in synthetic media and what it can be done is really important. And in training people to be conscious of a sense of urgency or any sort of pressure or manipulation to do that sort of behavior, like that transaction, is really fundamental. One of the biggest issues I have at the moment is I see a lot of these advices coming out, like people giving advice to say, hey, look for hands, look for, you know, shadows or, you know, imagery or stuff in the background that doesn't match up to spot a deep fake. And it's solid advice today, right? It works today. Like you can tell, especially with hands, right? AI has a hard time like putting hands. It's really funny.
It's almost comically bad at it sometimes, you know, where you're like, nobody's hand has ever bent in that position in the history of ever type. But that has gotten, honestly, massively better, even in the past few months. Like I think of AI image generation in general, where you used to be like, just don't put people in it, because the way it would put people in, it would just be bizarre. And now you can ask it to create images of hands doing things, and it's actually very quick to do it well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the concern that I have is seeing this advice where, hey, don't worry about deep fakes. Like you can tell that they're fake or synthetic by looking for those subtle irregularities. And in 6-7 months, you're not going to have those, right? They're just not going to exist. You're not going to have that layer where you can do that analysis and say, hey, this is a deep fake video or person, because the content has gotten so good. So I think the right way to kind of educate and teach is to focus on the awareness and that sense of urgency, right? That pressure to do that transaction, and teaching people to basically focus on that instead of looking for, the small little glitches in the video, because it teaches a false sense of security. You become, it's the same thing as like the watermarking, right? You look for that watermark, oh, it's not there, so it's legit. Or, hey, I don't see that subtle irregularity, so it's legit. But 6-7 months from now, like it's just not going to fly, right? So my concern is like people are walking in blindly to the future without thinking of the forward risks where we'll be in 6-7 months. And I think we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure a little bit.
It's funny you bring this up, because I think one of the things that we talked about, some of the underlying behavioral problems or opportunities that actually deepfakes are actually just exploiting, is really what it's doing. Because I think of some of the other things you said, we're also very distracted right now. People in general are distracted, which deepfakes can exploit this, because we're not, to your point of being more aware and conscious and situationally aware. Well, when you're hyper distracted, your brain's not really paying attention to these subtle cues. You're not really digging into this because you're kind of like half there, but not really. And it's much easier to kind of gloss over it. And again, a good example of this was, did you ever have the Highlights magazine? Did you ever grow up with the Highlights magazine? You remember this thing?
Yeah.
Okay. You know where there'd be like the picture and it's like find the 15 things that are wrong with it type of a thing. And like at first glance, you look at it and you're like, there's nothing wrong with this picture type. But then you actually start looking and you're like, oh, the umbrella's upside down, or the fish is out of the, there's always these like hidden cues, but you wouldn't pick up on those if you just quickly glanced at the picture type of a thing. And I think that vulnerability we have, and I think this goes back to kind of one of those behavioral things where you go, we'd be wise to slow down sometimes and actually take the time to be actually focused in and connected. Because to your point, looking for hands or shadows, while it may be outdated quickly, it's not necessarily a bad thing to go, hey, like be situationally aware and keep an eye open for these kinds of things. But don't assume that just because, oh, I saw hands, check the box, it's fine. It's one of those, like, it's much more complicated and nuanced than here's your checklist of things, just do this and then you'll be fine. Because to your point, you do that, well, that checklist just updates every 3 days as the algorithms advance. And you go, well, oh, now do you have the latest checklist? Oh, that's from last Thursday. Yeah, no, 6 of those 7 items, they're not accurate anymore.
Yep. You're spot on. And it points to another thing that I want to mention too, is that there's this, your employees, right? The ones that you want to educate or protect, right, are your most important assets. And there's a phrase that I keep hearing in cybersecurity that is literally driving me up the wall. That is that employees are the weakest link, right? That they're your vulnerability. And I think that's a wrong dialogue, and it again teaches the wrong behavior, right? I take the opposite track. I think that employees are literally your number one asset, period, right? The people that you work with, that you have, are literally your most valuable asset. And training and investing in them as people and giving them the knowledge to protect themselves is the number one step you can take in this day and age, right? There's a lot of focus on tech solutions and tools and stuff like that to solve this problem. And I don't think there's a silver bullet for deepfake, right? It's a multi-layered approach. But I think the number one step is your first line of defense, which is your employees. And not giving them that layer of education or knowledge about these threats of deepfake is setting them up for disaster. And you got to think, like, your person in marketing or accounting, they may not be aware of this stuff like that exists. Like, I talk to cybersecurity professionals, they don't know, right? So it's a false dialogue or a false way to look at it to assume that they're knowledgeable as well. So literally, I think your number one step is to train and do testing to make sure that your people are armed with knowledge to protect themselves.
You know, the awareness, the lack of awareness piece is, I agree, it's a huge gap right now, which is why one of the reasons I was excited to do this one was to just, again, create more awareness around where this is right now. Because I think people have heard, you know, they've probably heard something about deepfakes. There've been a couple big newsworthy deepfakes that have made the headlines, but it is very much represented in a way that seems like it's, I feel like kind of like when people talk about virtual reality, you know, people have this idea like, yeah, that's like out there. It's something in the distant future or far, far away. Only presidential candidates need to be concerned about deepfake technology because they're the ones who are going to get taken advantage of by this thing. And people aren't aware as much about, like, it's in your backyard. This could be affecting, even I just think of social media behavior. This could be shaping and molding the way you think about your neighbor. It may be shaping the way you show up to work. It may be, I mean, there's a lot of this stuff where it's like, no, this is in the air we breathe. And it's not something that you can just kind of ignore. And to your point, I run in so many tech circles. A lot of times I have to remind myself, like, hey, just because this is very familiar to you, most people have very little understanding of, one, the severity of the risk and how prevalent it is.
Yep. And it, as a security leader, like if you're in an executive position, it's your job, it's your mission, especially in cybersecurity, to educate and protect your users, right? And so I think it's a misstep that there's been a lack of awareness or training focused on addressing this threat. And the other thing that's really concerning too is that at the same time that deepfake has gotten so good, the tools that exist, right, have lowered that barrier that literally, like you mentioned, your next door neighbor could be doing this stuff. We're seeing news articles about students in middle school that are actually doing clones of their classmates, right?
Yeah, they're doing like the undressing app thing where it's like they're taking their peers and making images of them that aren't even them and using it to bully and exploit them. It's terrible.
Exactly. And that is part of the reason why it's so scary, right? It's because that barrier of use has been lowered, right? So you got to think the number one threat today is ransomware, right? We're seeing a big increase in ransomware, amazingly, right? But the thing about a ransomware attack is it does take a layer of skill. You have to do all this reconnaissance and penetration into the environments, DNS speaking, you name it, right? It's literally takes weeks to execute, in some cases, to do an effective ransomware attack. And your odds of getting paid are only 40%. And take a look at the Hong Kong example, right? Where you can do a deepfake in 5-10 minutes, right? And now anyone can do a deepfake. I think we're on the cusp that we're going to see an explosion in basically deepfake fraud and similar attacks to the one in Hong Kong because it's easier to do. The barrier is lower, right? And literally your next door neighbor can launch one of these sorts of frauds or schemes to get money. And I mean, gosh, the one in Hong Kong was 25 million. That's a very lucrative payday, right? So I think we're going to see
For very little work. I mean, that's the
exactly.
thing, especially as generative AI picks up its capabilities, its ability, because I think that's another one, like the live video. Even today, I think a lot of people are like, well, video is safe. Like text and images, there's maybe a growing awareness, like, well, maybe, whatever. But video is still in many ways seen as like, well, but that's that. If you see a video of something, it's still fine. And then when OpenAI launched Sora, and I mean, there were other ones that were doing this stuff where it was like, well, not anymore, because with a very basic prompt, you can go create a video of this and in seconds have a completely artificially constructed video. And again, what we saw with the China one was, I mean, you were talking to what seemed like live people. It wasn't even pre-recorded.
Yep. It's 25 million, right? That's a huge payday, but there's one thing as well to keep in mind, right? There's a lot of focus on video, text, and images for deepfake, right? But there's one vector that's particularly challenging, and that's actually audio, right? And the one attack that really stood out to me in the past year or so was the MGM attack, right? That was $100 million breach. At the end of the day, that attack cost MGM $100 million, and that is a mind-boggling number. That's that's insane.
A lot of money.
and that one was that was social engineering, where somebody picked up the phone and said, "Hey, I am this individual in IT. Please reset my credentials over a phone call to help desk." Boom, got in, right? And that was without deepfake. And so now we have audio, which you can deepfake, you can impersonate someone, clone their voice, and then execute that same style of attack, right? And that is really terrifying if you think about it. Like, it's just testing your controls. I think it's really fundamental too, right? Ensuring that you have the right countermeasures in place to protect yourself from deepfake too. But I think audio is really, it's an emerging threat, and I think it's one that is it's applicable across many different devices, right? So it's not just your desktop, it's your phone, someone picking up the phone and doing kind of that same sort of attack as well. So something to keep in mind
Well, and
is
to
that,
your point, I mean, to your point, and so I actually would love to transition to some of the ways that we can, because I think if you're listening or watching this, and this is where sometimes I balance this when I have these conversations with folks, because you can almost just see as people's minds start piecing this stuff together and going, wait, if you could do that, couldn't you do this? And if you could do that, couldn't you do this? And then couldn't you also do all this other stuff? And I think one of the things that's extremely concerning is even when you can prove something was fake after the fact, a lot of time the damage has already been done and it's really hard to undo what's been done. So I think of some of the things that, where some of these like middle schoolers were basically bullied and exploited. Even though the news comes out that it's like, well, that wasn't actually real, the reputation and like the people going, well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't, but people, it affects things. And so I think about some of this stuff. And so as I talk to people, sometimes you can just see them almost going, oh my gosh. But the reality is it's here and it's not going away. And you can't just, well, maybe some people can go, go off the grid and go live in Timbuktu and never show up anywhere else again. But that's not realistic for most people. So what are you seeing that works to help take steps towards mitigating this? Because we talked about some of the bad advice that maybe is like, well, I mean, it's a start, but it's not going to last you very long. What are some of the things that you see that are working that can help people just be better prepared for it?
That's a great question, and yes, you're spot on. Like living off the grid is not possible in today's age. But it starts with one. I think you have to test your susceptibility to it, right? So it's one, basically doing an assessment of your risk and testing your controls. So the MGM voice phishing or VISH, whatever you want to call it, is it's a perfect example. Someone had taken the 30 seconds to call the help desk and say, hey, I'm going to test to see if this is a vulnerability, right? You could have saved $100 million, right? Just that is mind-blowing in itself, not testing your controls. So I think step one is understanding your risk and your vulnerability points to deepfake. Are your employees vulnerable to it, right? So that's fundamental. And then two, it is a knowledge and awareness, right? So for example, the Hong Kong heist, if they would have known that deepfake exists or video and they had the right channels to verify transactions, that would have saved 25 million, right? So vulnerability testing, right, and user awareness training and testing would have saved $125 million if you think about it. That is just,
and that's just two events.
Two events, yep. And it's literally, so I see so much investment in these major cybersecurity tools, but you need to invest in your people, right? You need to invest in their knowledge and their training and their awareness, because without that, you're really setting people up for failure. So I think to answer your question, it's a combination of testing, it's assessing the risk, understanding your vulnerabilities, and then educating and making people situationally aware of these threats is how you prevent it. And then layered in with detection. So there needs to be a layer of basically detection capability into a lot of these kind of collaboration tools like video conferencing, etc.
I want to talk on the detection one, but I think that one's going to take a little bit because I actually want to unpack some of the ways that we see this going. I want to kind of recap on some of the other things you just said, because I think there's some really solid stuff in there. One around the awareness, because again, you can't fight against something you don't know exists. And so I think to your point, that awareness of, hey, keep your eyes and your ears open. Again, going back to your point earlier, I don't necessarily think it's bad to say, hey, these are things to maybe watch out for, but not to set them out as this conclusive, like, here's your checklist of stuff. So that at least you're kind of keeping this ongoing awareness to, hey, these are the kinds of things you may want to watch out, keep an eye out, be more attentive, focus in on this stuff. But I think one of the other things you really hit on that's super important is going back to the point that human behavior that a lot of deepfake exploits are preying on is that immediacy of reactions, or catching you when, in spots where, hey, there is no backup to this. And so whether that's personally or professionally, like thinking through to your point of assessing where are those vulnerabilities, and then what can I put in place to prevent me from making like irrational, quick decisions without having the time to think things through. I mean, I think of even how powerful like two-factor authentication is. As annoying as it can be, it can actually be a really helpful thing. And I know my wife goes nuts because she's like, it's so annoying. Whenever I try and log into something, it has to text my phone. And I'm like, right. But that even there gives you space and forces it to come to something that makes you think twice about what happened. And it's just creating more space to prevent you from doing something out of an irrational, just kind of immediate, oh, I got to do this. Cause that's really where it's catching you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what it comes down to is trust, right? It's trust in that reaction. And unfortunately, like in the state that we're in, I naturally, like, I always assume positive intent, right? I always assume that there's a good behind a conversation, right? Or people are generally predisposed to do good. And unfortunately, like, you have to lower that trust barrier a little bit, right? So you have to be able to take a step back and then say, okay, do I really trust what I'm being told, what I'm being said to, right? And it's basically, it's trusting a little bit less. It's challenging media and the situation that you're in, and in verifying that it is true, right? So like deepfake is a perfect example. Look at it, challenge it, but then try to find the source to verify that it is authentic, right? Yeah. Or is this true? And it's a sad state, and I hate that we're here, but it's the reality that in the near future you're going to have to be more cautious and be more kind of aware, and then challenge reality a little bit more, and then say, hey, is this actually the truth, right? It's basically defending the truth by knowledge, and that's what it comes down to.
Well, and it's funny because I think going back to your point about education and awareness being a critical factor in this, it's, a good example of this is I think of how society has changed. And, there used to be this news cycle. I'm just going to take news cycle as an example. Okay. There used to be a handful of trusted institutions that everybody kind of trusted. And at the time, you made money by getting the most people. So you had to kind of go to the vast majority. So there wasn't a lot of money to be made if you catered to one of the extreme ends of either of these things. And so that combination of things kind of made it such that, I mean, it's not that the news never got it wrong, or that you didn't have to kind of like trust but verify type of a thing, but there was a higher degree that you could trust. Where now you look at how quickly things have decentralized. Like, media sources could be a trusted source. It could be some random dude or girl who just typed into Chat GPT something and had AI create a really convincing website that looks really good on this. And before you know it, and I think society has struggled to realize and keep up with the fact, like, hey, we're in a different world now. And to your point, it's kind of unfortunate that we have to do that. And I think we are going to get back to a point, which is going to get to the kind of mitigating thing, where we're going to have to start to put some of this stuff in place, because I'm not sure we've quite seen the impact societally and psychologically on what it is going to do to people to live in a state of complete distrust, where you go, I don't even know what I believe anymore because I'm not even sure, what's real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's going to distort reality and trust. And you make a great point, right? Social media is where people get a lot of their news outlets from, right? Or their source of truth. And you're going to have to do a little bit more due diligence at this point to figure out what the true source of truth is. But great advice, like, to how to protect yourself, right, from deepfake is social media. And people have this notion that it's these hoodie-wearing hackers that are doing this stuff, and it's not true. It's not accurate, right? It's a very wrong misperception. It is people going to social media, downloading a picture of you or a video, and then using that to basically create these deepfakes So one of the best piece of advice that I give, and it's so simple. If you're uploading a video of a CEO, add background music, soft layer background music, right? That's really one of the things that you can do. It's so simple. But I basically, I take videos and I try to make deepfakes of CEOs just to test, right, that, this person's vulnerable, they have a social media footprint. And the ones that I struggle with, and I can't really deepfake very well, are the ones that basically have soft background music. And the reason being, AI listens for a human voice and it can't distinguish between the music and the human voice. So basically it muddles the whole thing, right? So it's literally like one piece of advice that I can give is if you do public announcements of your CEO or you upload video to social media, just add a layer of soft background music, and that will help protect yourself a little bit.
And what's funny even about that one though, and I think this is where you go, that works now. But how quick is the technology going to evolve where voice isolation, it's like, well, you can do whatever and you can scramble in the background and it's going to be able to detect it. But I think to your point, it's like, hey, what little steps can you take? I remember I did a cybersecurity episode. It's probably been over a year now. But one of the things we had talked about was, if you ever get a phone call from a loved one and it seems like this urgent thing, before you respond, just say, can I call you right back? And it's just such a simple, like counterintuitive thing to do. But I had someone send me a message. It was maybe a month and a half later that said, I'm so glad that I caught that because it happened to me. And I remembered it and I went, can I call you right back? And I could tell the person on the other end was like, no, but I hung up. And then when I dialed, it was like, no, I didn't call you. What are you talking about? Type of a thing. So it is some of these little things that, again, go back to human behavior that we can start to inject into our repertoire to, again, I don't think it's helpful to get to a point where you just don't trust anything. But I think to your point, the trust but verify, and how do you do that well?
Yeah, spot on. You hit a great point, right? And one of the things that you can do in those situations, right, is having like a passphrase or a protected word with your family. One big thing is
I don't know about you, but I grew up with one of those, and maybe maybe my childhood was just different than other people. But I remember, like, it was back in the Jacob Wetterling days, and so it was very much like, hey, if anybody ever comes to pick you up, like, this is our secret word, and if the person doesn't have that secret word, like, you don't go with them. It doesn't matter if they tell you I'm in the hospital or whatever. And I remember as a kid, somebody actually came to my school and tried to pick me up, and I was like, what's the word? And they were like, what? And I saw the look in their face and I immediately went, you aren't safe. And I left, and I found out later, my dad pulled up later and it was like, what? No, I don't. What are you talking about? So I specifically lived through that going, holy crap, it's real.
Yeah. It's such a easy thing to do, right? Just having that safe word or that passphrase that you can use between your family or even in your place of work, right? Just having like that secondary authentication method that you can use to verify like a transaction, right? But you're spot on. The other thing that's really scary are these virtual kidnappings, right? Have you heard about these using deepfake audio? It's basically they'll go to social media, they'll say, okay, someone's on vacation in Mexico. They'll find a video of them, download their voice, clone it, and then call the parents and say, hey, I've been kidnapped in Mexico.
Yep.
And having that secondary verification path, right, with the passphrase or the safe word, you can basically debunk that instantly and say, okay, I know this is a fraud or a scam or an extortion attempt. It's unfortunate, like, the people are vulnerable. Like, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about doing this and why I've jumped so far into this pool is my neighbor is a perfect example. Her name was Nancy. She was in her early 90s, and she was scammed from a phone call and lost her entire savings, like gone. It's like $15,000, and it was someone saying, hey, your bank account's been compromised. I need you to wire transfer everything over to this new bank account. She believed it. She trusted it and literally went and drained her entire bank account. And I died. Like, I was like, Nancy, this is what I do for a living, right? I do, fraud investigation. And next time that happens, you come knock on my door and I'll help you, verify that this is correct. But again, I look back to that situation. I'm like, had Nancy known that these sorts of scams exist, right, and been educated, like, she could have protected herself in that situation.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but yeah, having that passphrase is really important. Having a safe word, just to verify transactions as well, is really, really,
Well, and
really
I think that's where we're going to get to. So let's talk about some of these with the time we have remaining, of some of the ways that we're seeing steps towards more preventative measures. Because like I said, I think just not trusting anything isn't helpful. And I do see some of the fear creep in and people just stop trusting. It's like, well, don't do that. Come up with ways to mitigate it so that you can trust stuff. Again, going back to like the secret word. I mean, again, it worked for me as a kid. I immediately knew this person came up and said, your dad and mom are at the hospital. I need you to get in the car with me and take you there. And I was like, yeah, what's the secret? It it allowed me to go, I can trust people, because then when the next week somebody came and did it and I asked, they knew the word and it was like, okay, cool, like let's go, type of a thing. So what are some of the things that you think, specifically around AI deepfake stuff, that you think we will start to see that has the potential to at least help mitigate this? I don't think we'll ever beat it. There's always going to be people who are fighting hard to, push it forward, but what do you think will help with some of this stuff?
So I think we're going to see detection capabilities like emerge, right? So um, the ability to detect deepfake, but it's going to be an arms race. It's very similar to email phishing today. As an example, like a year ago, you got these mistyped emails, right, which were really just blatantly obvious. And enter Chat GPT, and now they're crystal clear, right? You can't really tell. Like, they look very
Yep.
legitimate. So it's going to be an arms race, unfortunately. Like, it's going to be a detection, and we're going to use AI to defeat AI, and use basically AI modeling to be able to determine what is real and what is fake. And I think that is going to be the next race, is building better detection technologies to basically um, to snuff out deepfake, right? And
So I'm curious with you on this one. I'm curious your take and what you've seen out there, because I think one of the challenges I continue to encounter when I dig into some of these things is when you're trying to combat an AI model that specifically was designed to mimic and replicate a person, right? Sound, speak, look like a person. And then you try and use AI to combat it. It can be very difficult, because then, and one area that I've seen this really go sideways is in in job detection stuff. So there's this rise in, companies that are using AI software to detect whether they think people's resumes were generated by AI, to try and weed this stuff out. And it's actually catching more real people than AI. And on top of it, my thing is like, hey, if you got somebody who's smart enough to know how to do some of these things, like, hire them by all means. But I see this even in higher education and things like this, where it's like, well, people are using AI to write papers, so we'll use AI to detect when they're using AI to write papers. And you're like, well, how is it? It doesn't necessarily do a great job of some of this stuff. And also, I see the struggle being so often you're intermingling. Well, maybe there's a part of it that a human is involved in, but AI is augmenting. Now, I think with pure deepfakes, that's different. But how do you see AI helping overcome some of those challenges?
that's a hard question. I'll answer it like from my perspective.
Okay.
So yes, it's going to be hard to distinguish between what is AI generated and what's not in certain mediums. The most challenging at the moment, I think, is audio, right? So um, I'm partnered with a company called Deeptrust, who've actually been able to very reliably determine what is deepfake versus not.
Okay.
And the way they do that is, it's basically, when your voice is cloned, right? There's indistinguishable sounds that are generated by the GAN model, right? So general adversarial model, right, is
Okay.
basically looking at deepfake, it's looking at content and saying, okay, I believe it or not, right? And it's rejecting the ones that it doesn't trust. And that's how it trains and gets better. But during that process, that learning and that training, there are subtle audio regularities that are indistinguishable from our ears, right? From the human factor.
It's like
But
the AI hum that it's like almost baking into it.
exactly. That's a perfect way to describe it, right? There's a trace that AI leaves behind while it's generating that deepfake audio, right? And so using basically an AI model, you can determine reasonably well what's deepfake versus not, but it's going to be this constant battle, right? As it gets better, you've got to improve the model too. So there are some really amazing technologies that are emerging to debunk deepfake.
And I would have to imagine a same type of, because that was my thoughts. I think the writing one is harder because no one's ever just, or rarely is somebody going to just take what AI said and then save it as a document. So, normally that's then going to be copied, pasted, merged, somebody's going to be doing something with it. And that's why I think with writing, it's extremely difficult. Although more and more you can just tell when people aren't really working with it, because you're like, well, if that phrase gets said one more time in the next 3 paragraphs, I'm going to know that you just basically asked ChatGPT to write that for you, because there's so many adjectives that nobody uses in English that have been thrown into here. But I think, to your point, the audio and the video and even the images, there has to be, whenever there's something created digitally, there is almost a fingerprint that is created as part of that, to your point, maybe we can't pick up with the human eye or the human ear or whatever, but there are these digital traces that get thrown in there that, again, if AI is trained to look for that, I would imagine that then it can go, like false. Like I can tell that, and even with that, I can imagine it would be able to detect when, because I think of some of the audio tools that I have where you can mess around with it, where it will, you could just take certain words and change it. And again, it would be able to detect, okay, hey, we're good here, but this, that actually has been dubbed with artificial intelligence because of that, basically AI hum.
Correct. Yep. Spot on. Yep. Then that's exactly what we do. And we're the only. So this is a partnership between my company Breacher and Deep Trust, where we're able to provide that analysis, but we do it on a managed service level, right? No one else is really doing that today. It's all kind of baked in at the enterprise level. So we're in a very unique position where we can basically debunk or verify deepfake fairly reliably, and with individual consumers as well, which is pretty game changing. So, yeah, it's basically, it's a great way to get a second opinion or verify content as being authentic or fake.
Well, and I have to imagine as then that matures, I'm just thinking back to the other examples of, like the incident with the China hijack, where you would then start to bake that into your enterprise applications. And it's basically always, it's like a smoke detector, just kind of looking for this stuff. And then all of a sudden it can pick up, hey, this video feed or whatever is going into this Zoom call is not actually even a person. That's actually being completely generated by something other than somebody's, webcam type of a thing.
Yeah. So there are some technologies that do that today. And but it's going to be that arms race, right? It's going to be AI versus AI, right? And who can do it better. So it's a brave new world, really, on all aspects. And it's going to be who can do it better at the end of the day is what it comes down to. Detect.
Well, I mean, that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing left and right now. I mean, just last week, OpenAI and Microsoft announced Stargate, and the march for AGI is well on its way. Good grief, the humanoid robot movement has completely come out of left field. I mean, it was one of those like, yeah, maybe someday we'll get to that point, and then all of a sudden, 2024, it was like every press release from every big tech company has some robot coming out and doing some sort of demonstration. So it's going to be it's going to be some crazy times ahead of us. I'm curious your take, as a leader in this space, as somebody who's spending a lot of time around it. What's your reaction to it? Are you excited about where we're going? Are you like what's your pulse check, your litmus test on how you're feeling about things?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. I mean, artificial intelligence is it's amazing, right? It is the next revolution, right? It is just an incredible thing. The scary part, I think, is that it will automate a lot of jobs, right? That is my kind of fear, is that a lot of jobs will be obsolete because of AI. Not completely, and that's good and bad, right? It'll help you with kind of the menial stuff. Um, there's a really good meme on Twitter that basically AI is automating. They wish that AI was automating basically doing the dishes and doing the laundry so that they could focus on art and writing, right? And it's doing the opposite. It's automating the writing and the art so that you can do the dishes and the laundry, right? So it's going the wrong way, which is funny. But it's so true. Like I wish like I had an AI robot to do my dishes. I freaking hate doing laundry and dishes. But I think it's a great thing overall, right? But you have to be situationally aware of the bad that it could potentially do as well, and wield it for bad. So it's this weird kind of duality, right? Or paradox, where it's good versus bad. So it's a little bit of both. Overall, I'm excited, but I'm also a little scared of what can be done with AI.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's encouraging hearing somebody who spends so much time around really like the protection and, getting into the fraud prevention and social engineering and mitigating some of that stuff, that you still have the optimism around it. Because I think sometimes I have a friend who used to work at Meta, and he worked in the division where they were, taking things off of Facebook that were not good. And it had a really negative effect on a lot of those people's mental health, because it was just like you see the underbelly of the world for so long, and pretty soon you have a hard time seeing the sun. And so I think the fact that even in your space, I mean, the thing that you, even throughout, as we've talked about all this stuff, well, we've talked about what the next generation of this stuff looks like and how AI is contributing to this. It's interesting how even in some of the examples you shared on all of these, none of this stuff is new. It's just a different way of executing it that is exploiting vulnerabilities in new and different ways. But really, when we think about deceiving people, exploiting people, trying to get things, taking shortcuts, all this other stuff, influencing in negative ways, you're like, well, good grief. We've been doing that since I do a lot of history stuff with my kids. I mean, propaganda was existing way back in like ancient Egypt and stuff like that, where you're like, well, ancient civilizations did this. So it's not new, but we keep discovering new ways to do it. And so there's just this effort to kind of fight and help bring the generation of people up to go, hey, this is the world we're living in. Here's how you live in it.
Yep, you're so spot on. Like, these social engineering phishing is not, it's not a revolutionary thing. It's been around for ages, right? And it's just a layer, it's an added medium, right? That's much more convincing and easier to do, which makes it so threatening and dangerous.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, for folks who have listened or watched this, our goal with this was not to cause you to panic or run out and go off the grid or build a bunker underground, because I don't think that's productive. But I do think, to your point, through this whole thing, greater awareness of what's possible. I think a greater focus on just being more present and mindful of some of this stuff. I created an AI version video of myself, and then one of me doing something, and I sent it to a couple people who know me. And the people who knew me quickly were like, that's not you, because they knew me. And I think it's just a testament to why, we shouldn't give up trust, but the effort to verify and spend more time being present and building meaningful relationships and looking for those vulnerabilities, I think is paramount, especially in the AI age.
Agree. Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Awesome. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining me on here. Again, hopefully everybody has just had a little more food for thought on how to mitigate and be prepared for the world we're in, because it's here now. This isn't in the future. This is the now. And hopefully it prevents you from being taken advantage of. So thank you all for watching and listening. I hope you have an awesome, awesome rest of your week, and we will see you on the other side.